Theodore Johnson killed his first wife, but in a strange series of events, he would soon be released.
To me, it was murder as opposed to he was convicted of manslaughter.
He was set free after just 2 years on the grounds that he had been the abused rather than the abuser.
Having served his sentence, he leaves prison. He meets a new woman, Yvonne Bennett,
who he also kills, claiming this time that his mind was disturbed by the fact that she was cheating on him.
Theodore Johnson proves to us all that the crime of passion argument no longer really holds any water.
In what's thought to be a unique case, the two-time killer was released to kill again.
This particular leopard doesn't change his spot.
What went on inside the mind of the serial killer, Theodore Johnson? In 2016, Theodore Johnson ran headlong into the path of a train. He survived his latest suicide attempt, but he was badly injured. Earlier in the day, he had killed a woman called Angie Best, a mother of 4, a grandmother too. She had made, quite literally, a fatal mistake.
She wanted to stop the relationship, he didn't. And the poor lady paid with her life.
To be in a relationship with Johnson was to risk being killed. Angie Best was the 3rd female partner who had lost her life at his hands.
Any sense of stepping out of line and disrespecting him by finding another partner, by standing up for themselves, would have been met with this huge, disproportionate anger and violence.
Who was this man who could simply not take rejection without killing? Theodore Johnson spent most of his life in England living in high-rise flats in the Midlands or in London. He had swapped the culture and lifestyle of Jamaica, where he'd grown up. What else do we know about the man who would create unwanted English legal history?
Theodore Johnson is born in Jamaica, one of 11 kids, poor family, and eventually he moves over to Wolverhampton, where he starts his new life with his young wife, Yvonne.
Certainly in the beginning, it looked as if Theodore Johnson wanted to have the normal and traditional life. He wanted children, he wanted a wife, he wanted an ordinary relationship.
And they lived in a flat on the 9th floor of a block, and he had a job in a local garage, and, you know, they'd had their family life. Things were going well for them.
It was 1981, but soon it was clear it wasn't all plain sailing.
The relationship with his first wife started to break down at some point.
To some, Theodore cut a distinctive figure because of his height.
Well, he's not a big man. He's quite slight, really. Demure, subdued.
Weighs just over around 110 pounds. So in terms of his physical stature, he isn't somebody that's particularly imposing, and perhaps feels a bit vulnerable because of that.
If he felt vulnerable, small, it did not restrict him from being violent towards Yvonne. There were reports from neighbours of her being beaten. It was a different era. The police seldom intervened.
I could personally attest that. I was a police officer in the 1980s myself, and when we used to go to calls of domestic violence and domestic disturbances, there wasn't the kind of support for victims that we have now. It was a kind of, well, this is a private matter, everybody should leave it alone.
It was a Sunday, and Yvonne wanted Theodore to dress for church.
It may have been about him feeling very belittled, about his wife saying that he wasn't smart enough to understand things to attend church. We also know that the type of argument they're having escalates.
He'd attacked her with various items, including an ashtray.
Then with a vase, then with a broom.
And then the argument supposedly went out onto the balcony, and prosecution and the police would say he pushed her off. He would say it was an accidental push and she fell over.
Yvonne Johnson was just 31. Yvonne and Theodore had 2 small children. Their mother was about to be depicted as a nagging wife who'd made their father's life a misery.
In fact, he holds that up as a defense. He says to the judge that, you know what, she would make me do housework. And the judge actually refers to this when sentencing. So instead of being seen as the perpetrator, instead of Yvonne Johnson being seen as a victim, it switched around. And all of a sudden, Yvonne Johnson is this horrible, abusive spouse.
She was the violent aggressor, not him. A judge and jury was asked to believe that no man should have to put up with a woman like Yvonne.
She forces me to do housework and washing up and cooking.
He explained his motivation for killing her as a kind of spontaneous self-defense. So he came at this by saying that she was the abuser and not him.
He even uses the ferocity of his attack to support his defense.
Because he used multiple weapons and it was frenzied violence, and he tipped her over a balcony, which is a very visible thing to do. You're not going to be able to hide that you've done that. So it can appear to the rest of us that that was potentially spontaneous rage. Somebody got very angry, lost their rationality, and look what happened. I could not have predicted this was going to happen.
Therefore, he wasn't guilty of murder, he was guilty of manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility. And that's what the court found.
It's an important distinction in English law. If a defendant can establish that his responsibility for his actions were diminished in any way, that he had been provoked or that he'd been abused, then the charge can be reduced to manslaughter. The sentence can be reduced from life too.
He's so good at reframing the story, about putting himself in the position of victim, that not only does the judge buy into it, but the sentence is reduced and it goes down to only 3 years.
And in fact, Theodore Johnson was released even earlier.
He was sentenced to be detained in a secure psychiatric unit.
He was designated mentally ill. If he could be treated, he would no longer be dangerous. That was what he argued. Former Detective David Nichol doesn't believe that Johnson had mental issues, but the authorities at the time did.
So for him to claim provocation and, oh, I'm a poor wee victim here, no.
And after 2 years, he was found to be cured, or at least sane enough to be released back into the community. And this happened, and of course there he was, Theodore Johnson, the killer, back in the community and able to form new relationships.
By today's standards, his treatment seems bizarre. A wife killer treated leniently because he was so put upon, and free after just 24 months. It was a sign of things to come for the way that Theodore could manipulate his way out of trouble.
This is kind of a real glimpse into Theodore's state of mind, right? And we see that he's very good at rewriting the story. He's very good at manipulating facts so that they work for him. Don't forget, this person was caught red-handed. This wasn't just someone that flipped and shot a gun. He beat this woman with 3 different household objects. Then he found the strength to tip this woman over a 9th floor balcony. So, this idea that he's this tiny, fragile little man seems far-fetched now, but clearly he manages to pull the wool over everyone's eyes and say, no, it was her fault. I was the victim. Obviously, this is what happened.
Back out, the man who had killed one woman soon went looking for another. The decision to send Johnson to a high-security psychiatric unit meant the probable use of medication. But he had been seen as the victim. He would not have been counselled about being a perpetrator of domestic abuse.
So he would have come out exactly the same person, maybe a worse person, than when he went in. And given the kind of person that Theodore Johnson was, he probably would have been searching for another stable relationship almost immediately.
He had wanted to be in a settled partnership when he left Jamaica, when he first arrived in England, and now that he was in London too.
He liked that stability in his life. He even felt entitled to it. So he would have found somebody quite quickly, and he would have speeded up those romantic processes straight away so that they would feel that they were perhaps in the middle of a grand passion. If they were in love, he was the perfect man.
So having served his sentence, he leaves prison. He meets a new woman, Yvonne Bennett.
Theodore is in a new relationship with a new Yvonne, and they move to a new city, and together they have a new baby.
He pushes the relationship along as quickly as he can.
But of course, the reason for speeding it up is to get that control as soon as possible, because he needs that. He needs to have that stability. He needs to have somebody else in his life who he can control and who will focus just on him. It's very important to him.
And you might think that, this is his chance to start again. But as is sadly so often the case, he doesn't change his way of dealing with the woman in his relationship. He doesn't change the way he treats her, and that relationship too becomes abusive.
He and Yvonne stay together for another 7 years. Is that a sign that things were going smoothly? Not, according to criminologist Jane Monckton-Smith.
If nothing comes along to disrupt the relationship, if they are maintaining control, if the victim is allowing that control to continue because probably they're too scared to do otherwise, that relationship could float along for 50 years. The trigger, the provocation, which is usually separation or rejection, could come at any point. So the fact that they were together 7 years shows more about his need for that stable relationship than hers.
Neighbours later described a relationship dominated by two things: regular shouting matches and Theodore Johnson wanting to keep a close eye on his wife, to know where she was morning, noon and night.
People who are controlling, like Theodore Johnson, who are very, very controlling, their partners probably don't have time to breathe on their own without him having given permission or not.
So we know that this is probably a tumultuous, a difficult relationship, because at least on one occasion the police are called in because of a domestic dispute. So the violence is there, but then things go quiet.
But inside the flat where they lived, there was turmoil. Johnson accused Yvonne of seeing someone else. True or not, he was not one to live with doubt.
This particular leper doesn't change his spots, and he carries on being abusive within that relationship. So much so that Yvonne calls police and says, he's been abusing me.
I think their relationship was breaking up and she wanted him out, but it's not the sort of thing we can get too involved in.
This is in an age where the police way of dealing with domestic violence wasn't as refined as it is today.
Johnson suspected an affair. A constant in his life was the willingness to self-harm or threaten suicide. Johnson would make serious attempts to kill himself on several occasions. Ironically, making threats to hurt himself was a way of protecting Johnson. It gave him the emotional upper hand, and it's what abusive, controlling people like Johnson sometimes do.
But one thing that quite often happens is threats to suicide. And this is to try and get the person who they're maybe losing to change their mind.
That was indeed the state of Johnson's mind. He would both use violence and threaten to end his own life. A controlling mechanism applied by a man who had already killed once. After she told him she intended to leave him, Johnson tried charm, bought her a box of chocolates. According to him, she rejected them.
Yvonne decides that she wants Theodore out of the house.
A very dangerous thing to do. He'd felt rejected by his first wife and killed. Would he kill again? In a North London police station, a call comes in.
1992, I was the Detective Chief Inspector in charge of the CID office at Holloway Police Station. I'm convinced it was a Sunday afternoon that the call came into the police station apparently from Theodore Johnson.
Emergency, which service?
When he himself calls the police and asks the police to go quickly to his flat because their child is on its own and he has to go and kill himself.
Was Yvonne dead at that point?
Well, he had left the flat and gone wherever he called us from. Remember, we were talking 1992, so not very many mobile phones and all that sort of thing. So I think the call came in from a call box. You need to go to that flat.
When asked where he's going to be, he explains that he's suicidal.
In a matter of minutes, police arrived. The caller had seemed distraught. They acted quickly.
There's a lady there and a child, so he was obviously concerned for the child, but knowing Theodore as we do know now, I'm afraid he intended to kill Yvonne, and he did succeed. But because he told us reasonably quickly, we got there, but couldn't save her.
Police were confronted by a tragic scene. A 2-year-old crying, her mother just yards away.
Unfortunately, that Yvonne Bennett had been strangled with a belt. Wasn't dead for very long, but unfortunately the officers couldn't save her. And the 2-year-old child was unharmed in one of the bedrooms.
Strangulation's a very intimate way to kill somebody. You have to get up close to them, you have to touch them, you can sometimes see their face, you can certainly hear them, and they will be struggling against you. So it's usually somebody that you have an emotional association with.
The reason he gives behind why he ends up killing Yvonne is the fact that she finds out that she's seeing another man, and it's at this point that he loses it. Again, there's something about this kind of hyper-masculine understanding of a certain respect he should be afforded.
There was no immediate sign of Theodore Johnson. Views differ on the motivation for what he did next.
He then, presumably struck by remorse and regret for what he's done, tries to kill himself by stringing himself up from a tree.
Just like in the case of the first murder, he's positioning himself as the victim. So he's not calling to say, I've done this, I'm the perpetrator. He's calling to say, I've done this, but actually, I'm not feeling stable. I'm feeling so bad that I'm going to go and kill myself. And in fact, the way that he chooses to try and kill himself suggests that this wasn't an actual threat at all. He tries to hang himself with string.
Some investigators have never been convinced that his suicide attempt was truly motivated by remorse.
Theodore had gone then out to Barnet somehow in a park and tried to hang himself with a piece of string. Well, string's not going to work in those respects, so he didn't manage to do that properly.
So he made big proclamations. He'd call the police and say, this is what I'm about to do. But, A, he'd give people a heads up of this is what they were about to do. He's going to try and kill himself. But B, his methods, seem very odd. No one hangs himself with string that breaks.
The suicide attempt becomes vital in the story of Theodore Johnson. Sane people, a theory went at the time, do not choose to kill themselves. At the very least, it's an indication of someone who is not of sound mind. His record showed that he had threatened suicide before even tried it. But was this behaviour part of a pattern of assuming the role of victim? The abused husband who'd killed when suffering diminished responsibility. Now the man who longed to die, remorseful because he'd killed again. The local head of CID began making inquiries about Theodore Johnson and did not expect to discover what was on his file.
Obviously, we go to check people's backgrounds, their previous convictions, and as I recall, I think that was the only one he had, was previously killing his wife up in Wolverhampton. Circumstances of that one came to us again as quite a surprise that he had pushed his first wife off a 9th floor balcony. It's appeared to me from what I read about it and researched that it was a very deliberate killing.
That was a conclusion that Detective Nichol reached. The facts seemed to suggest it. So he was surprised at the outcome that he was now reading about. a verdict of manslaughter.
But to me, that was murder as opposed to he was convicted of manslaughter.
Theodore Johnson had been released just 2 years after being convicted for his first killing. Was he about to claim diminished responsibility again and so have a murder charge reduced to manslaughter? Murder brings an automatic life sentence. Manslaughter can mean a much shorter time behind bars. If Theodore could prove a mental issue had caused the second killing of a woman, maybe he would be sent to a hospital facility. His suicide attempt established that he was not sane enough to be held responsible for murder. Surely, history could not repeat itself.
So even if people were prone to understanding and couching sort of that first murder, as a spouse who'd kind of been abused for so long that he reached the end of his tether, now that really calls everything into question, right? This has happened twice. There's been reports of domestic violence and the modus of not only how he operates around women, but how he then positions himself as victim is something that's happened almost identically twice in a row.
As difficult as it appears now to believe, Theodore Johnson did indeed argue diminished responsibility again. Was he about to avoid being found guilty of murder for a second time? In 1992, Theodore Johnson appeared before a court at the Old Bailey. He denied murdering Yvonne Bennett, his second partner, claiming he was mentally unwell at the time. Amongst the evidence he offered, his failed attempts at taking his own life.
Certainly his history of suicide attempts may have been seen more as a mental health issue than a control issue, and that actually might have supported his diminished responsibility plea.
The court accepted that his attempt at hanging himself from a tree with a string was evidence of a disturbed mind.
He was able to plead manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility and ended up yet again being sent to a mental institution rather than to prison.
His admittance to a psychiatric unit is quite strange, but there were other things that came into the picture like depression, and he had a history of suicide attempts, which probably made it look more like he was a man with mental illness problems.
And off he went. It was a manslaughter plea of guilty, diminished responsibility, and he was given a hospital order. Now that's a secure hospital, and in most cases, and as I say, my anticipation at that time would be he'd be in for a very long time, if not forever.
At least, for those who felt he should have been found guilty of murder, there was some consolation. It was unlikely Johnson would ever be released from a secure unit. For criminologist Jane Monckton-Smith, the verdict was a byproduct of different times. Though there's no defence of crime of passion, domestic murders are often seen in that context.
We're very, very used to using the crime of passion to rationalise these kinds of homicides. We have done for years and years and years. I mean, going back decades, we've used the crime of passion to understand domestic homicide. And what Theodore Johnson was saying was just underlining what we think we already know about this kind of killing. So it doesn't surprise me that it was successful.
Theodore Johnson, father of 3, killer of 2 partners, was locked up, very possibly never to be released. Except he was. He convinced carers he was no longer a risk.
People like Theodore Johnson, who have that type of personality disorder, will be very, very good at manipulation. Their whole life depends on it, really. They have to manipulate their victims. They have to manipulate the people around them to get what they want.
By the late 90s, Theodore Johnson was again on the outside.
We did discover, or the family contacted us some year later, I think they'd seen him in the street somewhere with an escort, allegedly some hearing to do with the daughter, the child. Well, I thought, that's all right, he's got an escort, he's out for that reason and that reason only. And now I discover, all these years later, he wasn't in for much more than 2 years. 2 years for his second killing.
Out, he's allowed to temporarily leave the institution where he is to commence a course in furniture restoration, trying presumably to rehabilitate him for life in the future. This is a man who's killed 2 partners.
Members of Yvonne Bennett's family couldn't believe that they'd seen Johnson out on the streets.
Oh, absolutely, astounded, and so were we. They're ridiculous.
Ironically, those who investigated Johnson have always accepted that women he randomly meets are safe from harm. It was not they who Johnson would ever want to kill. To know him, to be intimate with him, however, was to put yourself in grave danger.
We totally accept he's no danger to the normal lady in the street. Women who are strangers to him are no danger whatsoever, I don't think. But start a relationship with him and you're in severe danger.
Sometimes, and on day release, Johnson was escorted, but not always.
But of course that also left him free to meet potential partners, and that would have been important to him.
He's allowed to leave again on unescorted visits to gain an apprenticeship around furniture restoration, and it's during one of these visits that he meets Angela Best.
Angie Best is oblivious to the danger that she's in.
When he met Angela Best, the chances that she would be killed were very, very high. That does not mean that it was inevitable that he was going to kill her, but if you look at the timeline of how these things play out, if there was something that came along, like a separation, then it would become more inevitable.
At first, the temporary arrangement between a man she would meet only by day lessened Angela's chances of coming to any harm. But if Johnson was able to convince the authorities he was now safe to be permanently released, Angela would be in grave danger if Johnson's record was anything to go by. And he was about to get lucky for a 3rd time.
About a year after he started this course and started being released temporarily from the institution, Theodore Johnson's able to convince a mental health tribunal that he should be released permanently, and he is.
A stipulation is added to the conditions of Johnson's release. He could not start a relationship with another woman.
Where there's been a history of domestic abuse and there's been serious violence, it's not unusual for there to be licence conditions that that person has to inform the authorities when they are starting a new relationship. So it doesn't surprise me that that condition was put on Theodore Johnson.
However, a mere condition was not something that some officers felt would be a deterrent to the twice convicted killer.
Well, what can I say? What a weak condition to your release. Because, am I going to tell you? Because you'll be possibly put back in.
He wouldn't want anything to come in between him and that relationship. And if he thought that the police or the probation service were going to tell his partner about his past, that would have been a significant threat to him. He probably would have tried to hide it.
So I'm not going to tell you. And unless you start visiting at odd hours or putting surveillance units onto him, well, you don't do that. He just carried on.
In fact, he starts a 15-year-long relationship and nobody knows. Despite what was going on, he must have had some degree of charm, an ability to connect with women, to keep them engaged.
Johnson had killed 2 long-term partners. How could he justify starting a 3rd significant relationship? Having a woman in his life is something that Johnson appears to simply have needed.
There's obviously something in his past that has destabilised him in some way. He maybe doesn't feel safe in the world, he didn't feel loved, lots of different things like that. And he feels that he can get those things through a relationship, but it's a relationship he has to own and control. So whenever he comes out of prison, the first thing he's going to do is go and seek out another partner.
And his third long-term partner, Angela Best, seemed happy enough with Theodore.
So when he's released, he actually moves in with Angela Best. So he's lying on both sides. To the authorities, he's lying and saying, no, there's no relationship with a woman, even though he's living with someone immediately.
He manages to keep his past secret from her, keep the fact of his relationship with her away from the authorities, and perhaps crucially, she, Angela Best, has no idea for 15 years that she's living with this man who's killed his last two partners.
He's lying to her consistently as well.
She does soon suffer the same fate as the two women he had killed.
So it became clear that he hadn't changed at all, really. You know, it had just taken him a little bit longer to get to the stage where openly he was abusive to Angela. But he clearly had treated her in the same way as he'd treated his other two partners.
In 2006, 2011, 2015 and November 2016, Theodore Johnson, in planned meetings with his probation officer, lied by denying he was in a relationship, and he was believed. In the warped world of Theodore Johnson, a woman he barely knew was safe. And when things are going well in a relationship with Johnson, a woman seems to have been safe. How would Angela Best's time with Theodore work out?
So they're in this relationship for 15 years before Angela Best actually finds out about Theodore's past.
I think it's very difficult to try to imagine what it must feel like having been involved in a committed relationship for 15 years with somebody who's got two such dark and terrible secrets and kept them from you.
It's at this point that she leaves.
By leaving him, she had rejected him. By discovering about his past, she was endangering him. She could report the relationship that he had with her, so exposing that he had breached the conditions of his release.
And I guess there must be a real fear in her mind as well that I've just split up with him, or I'm just trying to split up with him. And is this how it's going to end for me as well? You know, do I need to be especially careful now?
She did. Johnson only knew one way of dealing with things when relationship issues caused him to get angry. He killed. Angela Best had left Theodore Johnson. Soon after, he hears she may be in another relationship.
It's not until he finds out that she's seeing another man that he asks her to come back.
Johnson was at his most dangerous, and just before Christmas 2016, Angela was on the way to see him.
On the 16th of December 2016, Angela Best is going to help Theodore Johnson with an appointment that he has at the Jamaican embassy.
When this kind of thing happens, the person has manipulated a situation where they are going to be alone with the person they want to kill.
Unlike the other two cases, which seem to happen in the moment, out of fury, in the case of Angela Best, he decides to call her back. There seems to be a sense of premeditation here. So he calls her back to his house, asking for help to fill out some forms. And she obliges. She comes back. This is someone that she's known for 15 years.
We know she leaves their former home to go to him, and that she arrives where he's staying at about 9:20 that morning. During the course of the rest of that morning, her son wants to get in touch with his mum. He's phoning up, but gets no answer. And nothing's heard from either of them until at 3:25 or thereabouts that afternoon at Cheshunt in Hertfordshire. A man throws himself under a train on the railway line. Police are called to that incident, and they find that that man is Theodore Johnson. And he's badly injured. He's lost limbs. He's in a bad way, but he's alive.
Again, he went off to commit suicide. Threw himself in front of a train, and again failed, other than causing himself severe injury. No consideration for the people on the platform or the driver or anything of that sort, or the medical people that have to look after him.
An attempted suicide can be a telltale Johnson sign. it can mean a woman is dead at his hands.
And so police go to the address they have for him, which is the address in Tufnell Park in North London, where he'd lived with Angela Best. When police go there, they get no answer, and they go in, fearing the worst. And indeed, they find that Angela Best has been murdered. Lying by a sofa, and she's dead.
She was hit with a hammer several times, in fact 6 I think the post-mortem report said, and strangled with a cord from a dressing gown. So there you have, between the first, second and third cases, violent hitting, strangulation, so the third one was a culmination of the first 2. But I'm afraid eventually the circumstances came round. She wanted to stop the relationship, he didn't, and the poor lady paid with her life. Let down from every angle, I'm afraid.
Was the latest suicide attempt a prelude to a defence of diminished responsibility? Perhaps not. In his attempt, Johnson lost an arm and a hand. This time, his attempt at suicide seemed genuine.
Despite the fact that he survived jumping in front of the train, he probably did want to kill himself. It was after a 3rd homicide. He must have known that he wasn't going to get away with it a 3rd time. It may be that he wanted to maintain control of his own life and his own decisions, and it was his decision to end his life, so that's what he was going to do.
Now retired, Detective David Nichol learned about the details of the latest Johnson killing, a man he thought he had helped put away for the rest of his life.
Well, I read the headline in the newspapers and really couldn't believe it. When I read down through the article and found it was Theodore Johnson, I was, well, disappointed, to put it mildly. I wouldn't like to say how disgusted I was that he had killed for a 3rd time, and then to discover that he had got out so quickly after the conviction on the case I dealt with.
Why had he done it? What was it that the diminutive Johnson wanted most in his life? Was it to have a female partner, or was it to dominate a female partner? A question for psychologist Linda Papadopoulos as she considers what went on inside the mind of the serial killer Theodore Johnson.
A lot of his actions speak to his need for control. So while things were going his way, it seems that it was fine. As soon as someone, came out of line, he would, it seems, resort to violence. And this was evidenced by how often he was, called the police in to kind of deal with domestic disputes. And then ultimately, the fact that time and time again, 3 partners in a row end up being killed when he feels somehow that he's been disrespected, somehow when he's lost that control.
True to form, when Theodore Johnson was accused of killing Angela Best, he refused to accept it was murder. He did indeed look as if he was attempting to get the charge downgraded to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. There was a real possibility that he would again escape a life sentence.
Theodore Johnson was charged with murdering Angela Best, and he denied it. And he denied it right up until the first day of his trial at the Old Bailey in January 2018.
He wouldn't have had any idea what he put his victims through, because he would only be seeing things from his perspective. And his narrative in court would have had no insight at all to what actually happened. Everything would have been a manipulation.
It was part of a game, one Johnson had won before. A lighter sentence for a lesser crime had been his reward. But, probably advised that he had slim chance this 3rd time, he had a change of heart.
And decided to plead guilty to murder. So there was none of the trying to prove provocation or diminished responsibility that had happened with his previous 2 cases. This time, he just admitted straight up, yes, I killed her. And that gave the judge no option but to sentence him to life imprisonment, because the minimum sentence for murder is life imprisonment, and that's fixed by law.
Still, the Johnson cat-and-mouse game that he played with the justice system continued. The judge recommended a 26-year minimum prison term, which would have made Johnson 90 years old on release.
He, presumably on advice, appealed that length of time, and the Court of Appeal looked at it and decided, yes, it ought to be altered, but it ought to be put up and they raised that figure to 30 years. So he will spend 30 years in prison before he can even be considered for release.
Yvonne Johnson had been thrown from the balcony of a high-rise flat after being beaten repeatedly with the nearest weapons that Theodore could find. Her sin was to ask Theodore to dress well for church.
So this was very much about ensuring that they knew who was boss, that they didn't step out of the parameters, that he felt represented this man that he needed to be in his eyes, this kind of hierarchy of who was in charge, who was in control.
Yvonne Bennett had been strangled with her belt. Her sin in the eyes of Johnson was to fail to submit to the regular beatings that she received.
I think what we're seeing here is someone that possibly felt less than, perhaps because of his size, perhaps of his experiences of being devalued or not respected by those around him.
The sin of Angela Best was to have uncovered the truth about the man who hadn't told her of the two others he'd already killed.
So that when he found someone that was in his life, he felt in order to control them, he had to subjugate them. He had to be the powerful one, to put them in line.
The three women, unwittingly, had become a unique part of recent English legal history. In his 46 years as a Met detective, David Nichol had never seen such a case. Theodore Johnson is a unique serial killer.
In the circumstances of killing, serving a sentence, killing, serving a sentence, and killing again. The last time I researched it, I think there was 60 plus cases over several decades who had killed, served a full sentence for murder, as in life sentence, come out and killed again. But nobody, and I'm afraid I rather told the relatives of Yvonne Bennett that we wouldn't expect to see him out for an awful long time. We were let down by the system all round, I'm afraid. Most people, the vast majority, having killed a second time, just get such a long sentence that they don't come out and they don't kill a third time. I think it's almost unheard of.
Theodore Johnson lost both of his hands after his latest suicide attempt and will not be released, if at all, until he is 94 years old.